Oh, well, hello there. Welcome back to Introduction to Cultural Anthropology. Um, Today we're going to be talking about gender and sexuality. This is obviously something that is sort of a big talking point within our country, so we're going to focus today primarily on sort of American viewpoints on gender and sexuality, and then we'll also explore a few places around the world that do things a little bit differently. Um, but we'll try and kind of deal with some of these concepts of why it's important to understand what is gender and what is sexuality and how do they relate to each other. So, okay, so let's look at it like this. Are men and women born or made? Okay, big question here. Anthropologists make the distinction between gender and sex, and that's something that we really need to make sure that we understand, um, because what we consider to be male or female traits are basically products of culture. Okay, so we create a ideology around what it means to be masculine, what it means to be feminine, um, and then we implement that ideology within our culture, and that's how we make those determinations. And in our in contemporary and historical sense, we have oftentimes had a very binary look at gender, right, and the roles that it plays, and also about concepts of sexuality, and even the biological sense of like what parts are you born with, and things aren't always as clear cut as you might think. We'll talk about some of that. Sex is when we look at sex, it represents the observable biological differences, especially concerning human reproduction. Okay, so it's that biology that helps us make other humans. Okay, and gender is the cultural expectation and practice of a community as it assigns roles to that sex, right? So it's the cultural practice of saying, well, you've got these bits, you've got these bits, these are the rules for you, these are the rules for you, and that's how we're going to do things. Um, so that's kind of how we as anthropologists look at gender and sexualities, creating the distinction between both the biological aspect of it, and then also the cultural aspect of it. So, what is sexuality? Um, and when we look at sex in general, we actually have a hard time sort of defining what that actually is. Our sort of idea of sex in this country uh, has been challenged by different groups, even just the act of sex. Is it all entailing of any sort of sexual behavior, or is it one particular practice? Um, is it one thing? Is it just intercourse? Is that what sex is, or does it include all the myriad things that you can do without the actual act of intercourse? Um, Not everyone agrees. Different religions have different ideologies around sex and the practice of sex and when you should do sex. Um, and we see changes within certainly American ideology around sex that informs us as to how we should behave around this subject. Um, and that's because we're very diverse. We're a very diverse country with lots of influences, lots of ideas, which also means that there's lots of conflict around this. We are not a monolithic country, which I believe is very beneficial. But at the same time, it's hard to create firm definitions about one idea or another because there's always going to be some sort of a conflict around it. No one's ever going to agree on one particular thing, and there is always going to be conflict. As long as we know that, we can prepare for whatever's going to come next. As anthropologists, when we're looking into the idea of sexuality, we sort of split it up into two different groups. We look at sexuality as desires, beliefs, and behaviors related to erotic, physical contact, intimacy, and pleasure, right? So this is what happens in the bedroom, right? So this is the things that we want, the things that we believe, the things that we aspire to, our behaviors, our practices, all around the act of sex. And then we look at sexuality in the cultural arena, right? Where we try to see what is morally right. How do we consider what is appropriate or natural? And how does this relate to, again, things like power structures? What are privileges? What are the resources available towards sex and sexuality? And as I talked before, we have this idea that gender is culturally constructed. You are born with a particular sex, okay? Most of the time, the argument, especially in the United States, is that there are just two sexes, right? You're either male or female. And this is not factually true. And the reason why it's not is because not everyone is born with the same bits and pieces at the same time, right? And we'll get to that here in a second. We culturally construct it through our daily lives, right? Gender is how when we go to school and we see other people that have been classified as male or female and their behavior, we learn that behavior. When we are taught by our teachers and our friends and our families about what it is that is culturally appropriate for that gender, how we talk to each other, how we interact, how we learn how to deal with conflict, whether or not we can join the military and what roles that we can have, right? All of these things, even to our names and the way that we dress, all of these things are culturally constructed, right? Just for an example, and as to how that has changed. If we go back 100 years, it was a very masculine color, the color of pink. Pink was masculine. Blue was feminine. Okay, so if you were seen as a masculine individual, if you were a tough guy, it would be totally appropriate for you to wear the color pink. And if you were very feminine, then blue was the color that you would normally wear and associate. So even like, if you were to have a baby, right, a child, you would dress them in those gender appropriate colors. You would dress the boys in pink and the girls in blue. Now that obviously changed, right? Today, especially when you see things like gender reveal parties with, the expectant parents, and they find out what gender what sex, I should say, their child is going to be, and they pop a balloon and it's blue glitter or it's pink glitter, blue being for the boy and pink being for the girl. Something along the line changed, and we decided as a culture to sort of flip those color designations for this particular gender or that. So those things can change. So other ideals around gender can also be changed. And we see this because around the world, people have different ideas about gender. And so this construct of gender is culturally influenced. So is this a biological thing? Yes and no, right? Sex is a biological event. It is considered a part of the natural world. It is a part of all of our lives. But there is a biological reality, and then there is the cultural reality, right? While the process is natural and it's needed for the species, right, to continue to propagate and grow more humans, how we deal with sex is definitely cultural. Um, we do, as far as like as a species, we're one of the few species around that actually has sex for pleasure and not just for procreation, right? There are very few species of animals that actually engage in sex for fun or for other social events or needs for that community. So humans and dolphins, um, other great apes, um, will engage in sexual activity for fun and for recreation, for apologizing or consoling another member of their species or their community. They will actually engage in this practice, um, not just to ensure the procreation of the species. Um, Humans itself, ourselves, we don't usually engage in public sex. It's usually a private affair. Um, that's not always the case. Um, but we are one of the few species that biologically we usually have sex face to face. That is not common uh, in the rest of the world, and that might explain some of our connections and our ideas about the concept of love. Um, as and how we sort of pair bond, have those emotions, create those emotions, right? Is through this practice of looking at each other, gazing into each other's eyes, and all that great stuff. Um, so the fact that biologically we can do that might actually help to explain why we have developed the way that we do, and sort of our evolution, and our concepts of love and what kind of an influence that has on our daily lives. So uh, I want you guys to think about, how do we determine gender culturally? What are the things that we do that determine whether or not you're going to have a masculine existence or a feminine existence, right? So I want you guys to pause the video, and think about some of the things that we do that has this influence. Okay, so we're going to pause. Okay, hopefully you're back. Hopefully you've written something down. Let's talk about some of this stuff. So some examples. What is in a name, right? Naming practices. This is one of the ways that we determine gender. We have gendered names, right? What do we consider to be a woman's name or a man's name, right? And then what names do we sort of allow to go back and forth, right? That might be gender bouncing, and even the spelling of those names can change depending on the gender, right? I think about examples like Chris. Like a man's name's Chris might be Chris, while a woman's name that's spelled might be Cris, right? Same name, but we've gendered the spelling of that particular name. My own name, the name that I go by, Joe, Joe, right? However, I have friends that are Joe as well, but they are Jo, because that's the feminine spelling of Joe. So we genderize names, right? Doctors. This is kind of a big one, because doctors will determine sex at birth, right? You're born, and you've got the bits that you are born with. And the doctor says, oh, you've got these on that birth certificate. This is what you're going to be. And that's the first place that you are determined what it is that you're going to be a part of in society. That's the first moment when you're born and that doctor says, oh, male, oh, female, right? That's that first act of gendered ideology, is having that. Then you have family, right? Family is being a part of, one of the ways that we learn and grow and, you know, uh, um, become our own identity. We learn those gendered traits from our family members, right? What does dad do? What does mom do? What does brother or sister do? Friends, right? We go to school, you meet people out of school, their behavior is going to determine your own ideas about uh, gender, right? And how you should behave in any given circumstance. School and education, of course, right? What is the proper way of doing this? What is the history of doing this? Government. Everything in government helps to sort of identify the roles that you can have, even applying for a job or um, even things like banks and stuff like that. One of the first things that you have to do in that application is, what is your gender? How do you identify? Right? Religion, that's a big obvious one. Gendered ideology is usually a very strong component of religious practice, right? To the point where, some religions are segregated based upon their gender, right? Clothing, that should be an obvious one. What's appropriate for one particular gender to wear versus what's appropriate for a different gender to wear, right? I think about things like dresses. I remember growing up and seeing dresses, and then I remembered watching, I think it was like Braveheart, and you had these guys running around in kilts, and I'm like, but that's a dress, right? That's a dress. It's the same thing as all these girls are wearing. Why is it masculine that these guys are wearing kilts? And how do we recognize the difference between a kilt and a dress? How do we see this as masculine? How do we see this as feminine when the cloth is doing the same thing, right? And so we have this, again, different cultural ideologies about what is appropriate. And I remember the first time I saw a guy wearing a kilt, and I'm going, wow, he's wearing a dress, right? Different cultural ideologies, different experiences, challenging those experiences, right? Chores and jobs, right? How do we determine what a job is for someone, whether or not it's gender related? What about healthcare, right? Why do we have an overabundant number of men as doctors and women as nurses? Right? What is it in our society that first said that this was the appropriate way of conducting medicine, right? When both are capable of doing either, right? Both intelligence and capability, either one can do it. But we've created these different gendered roles that traditionally has been influenced and still has an influence even today, even in the realm of anthropology, right? When we look at the numbers of students that go into anthropology as a field of study in college or university, it's usually 2 to 1 in favor of women that are looking into anthropology. But when we actually go into the field and look at even the folks becoming professors and stuff like that, it's still dominated by men, right? So even the ratio of getting jobs within the realm of anthropology, even though there's considerably more women in anthropology in an academic sense as students, professionally it's still highly dominated by men. And that's changing and has been gradually changing for a number of years. But it's still a part of our field and our existence and how we do things. Um, so, right, but what are the reasons for that? Why do we see so many people going into anthropology, so many women going into anthro? but not getting jobs afterwards, or not continuing on to uh, um, uh, uh, graduate school and becoming masters and PhD students, and continuing that process. And it's because we still have sort of gendered ideology around family making, right? College is a prime time to meet your potential mate. And if you get married and start having a family and children, a lot of times, because gendered ideology favors, especially in the United States, favors women at home taking care of kids, guess what ends up happening is we start seeing more and more of that taking place. So we have to take that into consideration too when we're looking at the practice of something and the ideology of something. All right, the performance of gender in the United States, right? So if we think about gender in the United States, we are oftentimes thinking about that masculine and feminine um, traits that we exhibit. Like, men are aggressive and they're tough and they're competitive and they are sports oriented. We use terminology that is oftentimes related to um, sports, right? Going for a Hail Mary or knocking it out of the park. These are terminology and language that helps to reinforce sort of these ideological ideas around masculinity. Um, and if we look at like feminine traits, right? Gentle, loving, nurturing, right? Smarts, that's a new one, right? It used to be that ideal trait did not include intelligence, right? Obedience was probably more likely in place of being smart. Persuasive as being a feminine trait, yes. Talkative, enticing, emotional, right? These are all feminine traits. But I mean, if we really look at these things, right, these different traits, everyone has them, right? Everyone has all of these traits, both masculine and feminine, and they reassert themselves and express themselves in different ways depending upon whatever circumstance we are living in, right? Um, think about a father with a newborn child and growing that child up. Oftentimes, showing some of those feminine traits of being emotional, of being nurturing and loving and gentle with those children, right? Those would be considered feminine traits. So, but a guy can express those too, right? If we think about women who go into business, right? They have to be aggressive, they have to be tough, they have to be competitive, driven and unemotional to make it in business. Um, and oftentimes, they might show those traits, but then get labeled with a term like, well, she's a bitch or something like that because she's exhibiting these traits. But again, these traits are associated with gender, but are expressed by everyone. They just express them in different ways because we have been, again, taught to express these things in different ways. So, are there more than two sexes? And the answer is yes. 1.7% of births do not conform to standard ideal definitions of what we consider to be male or female. And this is because our genetics will sometimes veer in different ways, right? And sometimes you might be born with both male and female genitalia at the same time. You might be born with a testicle and a penis, and then you might also have ovaries at the same time, right? And so what happens when you're born with both? And this isn't a rare event. Okay, this isn't something that is like 1 out of 100,000 people. No, this is basically almost 2 out of 100 people are born with um, both uh, non-conforming genitals, right? So you have, um, if we think about, say, the Denver metro area, there's about 3 million people that live in that area. That's about 50,000 people, right, that live in our community that have um, a different biological experience, right? They were born slightly different. Now, the interesting thing about this is that um, folks that are born with um, the absence of or addition to bits and pieces of their genitalia and their reproductive organs, um, they have a really interesting experience about being born and then having that determined, their gender and their sexuality determined at birth. And we'll talk about a little bit more of that here in a minute. The problem here is that within American culture, and especially in a historical sense, we have had a very binary ideology when it comes to gender. You're either male or you're female, and we don't take into account all of those people that are born sexually different, right? And there are a lot of them, right? Um, and the thing is we're seeing all of this being expressed, right? That these people have been here, they've been living here and existing with all of us for all of this time, but culturally they were not capable of expressing themselves in a particular way because of cultural pressures, right? Um, so when we think about what's happening today, it's not that people are suddenly, choosing to do this. It's that they are being allowed space to finally express, right? And that's the big thing that is sort of important to understand, is that this isn't a new thing. This is a species thing that has been happening to us for a very, very long time. And we know that this is a species thing because other species do the same thing, right? Other species, when dealing with concepts of sex, they don't always do the heterosexual thing, right? And in fact, even reproduction is done in different ways in which the like, if we even thinking about like things like seahorses, right? I think seahorses are fascinating as a species because after procreation, the father, right, actually carries all of the eggs. The eggs get deposited into the father, and the father carries around those eggs, right? That's a totally different way that a species will um, continue to survive, but it's a different reproductive practice, right? We have sharks, and we've had other species that will create children without having a sexual partner, right? Their biology just says we need to pop a kid out. We're basically just going to clone ourselves and pop a child out. And we know this because we've had sharks, female sharks, in aquariums where there wasn't another shark to be able to have uh, um, the process of sex, and they just generated a new child, right? So different species do different things, and so we need to understand that biologically this is not an uncommon thing. That within our world we see different reproductive processes, and if we want to understand that and understand why things are happening the way that they are, we can do that, right? But we also have to understand the cultural impacts, right, of how things have been organized. So what happens to those who don't fit that norm, right? So we're talking about the LGBTQ community. we're talking about trans and queer kids and asexual kids and um, lesbian and gay, all of the LGBTQ plus community. Um, and it's an interesting situation that as we look at what's happening, sort of that expression of identity. I mean, I can remember, that throughout the last couple of decades, we've expanded even the concept of LGBT, right? It used to be just um, lesbian, gay, and bisexual, and then we started learning about trans, right? Being a trans child or being a trans adult, and then adding that in, and then adding the concept of queerness, right? And what is queerness? And then going beyond that and accepting that plus, right? Plus that there's a spectrum out there that um, looks at gender and sexuality outside of the norm, right? Outside of that historical context. Um, so what happens to these folks, right? If you think about the LGBTQ community when it comes to um, religion, politics, marriage, right? Being able to get married and have health care, right? Being able to share healthcare or death benefits, right? You spend your life with someone and they die, but because you can't get married, what happens to the house? What happens to the stuff? What happens to the parental rights? All of those things go up in question. Um, and so, what happens if your spouse goes into the hospital? Who has the right to make decisions for you, right? That power of attorney. So these are all like serious questions when it comes to what can you do. Um, so yeah, these are big issues that are facing um, members of this community. So, sort of thinking about this again, going back to that number of 2 out of every 100 people are born not as a um, traditionally recognized sex, right? Strictly male or female. One of the issues that a lot of these individuals will face is the fact that their identity is connected directly to that sort of binary ideology that's been in place. Um, and what's happened in the past is that we've had where like doctors, right? The first thing that doctor's going to do is they're going to take that child, and it has been a known practice and many years back that when that doctor first pulls the child out, right at birth, looks down and sees, oh, well, we got something different going on here, right? This child does not sort of meet the standards for being male or female. The doctor, in days past, would sometimes uh, conduct what we would call like gender affirming surgery, saying like, oh, well, this child exhibits more feminine traits, but still might have some male traits being expressed. So we're going to cut and snip and make this expression full female, right? Or full male. Um, so that uh, as this child develops, they are going to look and possibly behave, and most likely not behave, because that usually doesn't work the way, because hormones are there, right? And you've got both hormones going on, and you've got both sets of genitalia creating those hormones. But oftentimes you'll have that doctor, and that doctor would sometimes do it without the permission of the parent, or sometimes that parent would be told about what their child was born as, and that parent would then make the determination of both sexuality and gender affirming expression. Okay, so that's not an uncommon event within our society. Today, just the doctor doing that, at least in the United States, doesn't really fly anymore. It depends. Excuse me. It depends on what community you're in. But parents always have that and should have that right to understand what's going on with their child. So, you know, that takes place, right? Then what happens to those kids afterwards as they grow up? Sometimes they might not know that this surgery took place, that, they were born with multiple bits and pieces. And then that influences their lives, right? Influences how they feel, influences their chemical balance in their body, because you've got different levels of testosterone and estrogen that are being used. And so it's going to express in different ways. How do they work as an adult? How do they live their life dealing with these kinds of issues and being outside of the norm? Right, and historically we've seen a lot of repression, especially in the United States, repression and trying to fit the norm, or going into subcultures and communities in which that is acceptable. But even knowing that there are places like that can be difficult to find when you're in a state where that sort of gender fluidity is expressly condemned, because it was in this country, right? And to a certain extent still is, depending on where you live and what politics you follow. You can definitely see that there are different consequences, right? So again, when we think about what's happening right now, it's not that these folks are just popping out of the woodworks. They've always been here, but they've had to deal with the different cultural implications of the time, right? And being able to conform to cultural ideology to fit in. And that's why we know that there's that kind of stuff going on. All we have to do is look in our history book and find individuals that conformed. They got married to the opposite sex, but they were definitely gay, right? And but they couldn't express that, right? It wasn't until much later when that part of themselves was actually revealed. And this sort of leads us to this idea of alternate sexes. Right, in our society, we've taken a very binary approach to things, but other cultures around the world have looked at these individuals that are born with both sets or different aspects of that sexual or biological existence, right? They're expressing both male and female traits. Different cultures around the world have reacted differently based upon these individuals. If we look at some Native American groups, a common term that is developed over the years is this stance on like two spirits, right? This person was born with two spirits. And these two-spirited individuals were oftentimes looked at in a very positive light. They were oftentimes seen as shamans, or seen as spiritually connected, because they are both expressing male and female attributes, which means they are connected to both, right? And seeing that connection to both allows them to travel in both realms. And that became very, very special, right? A different approach from what we see here, primarily in the United States. They were oftentimes celebrated because of their uniqueness. Modern day, some modern day tribal groups have sort of acquiesced to modern American takes and conservative takes on sort of gender ideology. And so we don't see as much of that expression being recognized, but it's still there and it's still taking place, and that community is still, in some ways, able to find a place in those communities. And so we also have cultures that express more than just the binary. And so this is just a short list of some of the places around the world that um, recognize more than just two genders or two sexualities. Um, that see that there is more of a spectrum when it comes to um, this ideology. So we've got the Zuni here in the United States and Arizona. You have the brother boys and sister girls in Aboriginal Australia. You have Hawaiian, the Mahu in Hawaii. You've got the Philippines and Italy, Congo, Dominican Republic, the Incan, and the Lakota, again, here in the United States, that have this different recognition of gender and gender roles and sexuality, and made space for them, right? They were inclusive and they added them in and they brought in their own uniqueness to the community. And I think it's important to recognize that all around the world and on every continent, we see this taking place, and we see different cultures recognizing that there is a place for them, right? So, when we look at gender and sexuality and how it gets expressed, um, it is very much a cultural thing to understand how they're going to fit within this community. Okay, so we're going to pause there. We'll stop there, and then you guys can come back and we will continue this discussion about gender and sexuality. All right, we'll see you in a few.